Hello listeners, today I'm going to discuss something called East Meets West, an infographic portrait by Yang Liu. Now, Yang Liu, she's an artist and she was born in China and she moved to Germany when she was 14. So she grew up in both countries. And she made these series of pictures, I think about 10 years ago now, basically to illustrate the differences between German culture and Chinese culture. And I'm not German, but I think many of the German cultural characteristics are fairly similar to the Anglosphere. I'm from Australia, and I think they're fairly similar to those of Australians as well. And I live in Taiwan, and there does not seem to be any difference, based upon these pictures at least, between China and Taiwan in terms of culture. So I'm going to discuss these now. Two things about these. Firstly, all of the pictures are divided in half. There's a blue half and a red half. The blue half is the German or Western culture, and the red half is Chinese, or I guess Taiwanese as well, culture. And the other thing is that I'm looking at all of these on a web page altogether, so the images aren't that big, and I can't actually read what it says on the images, so I'm just taking a title that's written below them. I don't know how accurate that is, because firstly I don't speak German. I can understand little bits of it, but I don't speak it. And the Chinese characters are too small for me to be able to read as well. So, don't say, that's not what it says on the pictures, right? Okay, I'm just taking the titles from this web page. So let's have a look. The first one is lifestyle, independent versus dependent. So on the left, the blue part, the German part, you can see people like to be alone. They like to do stuff alone. They like their private space and so on, which I think is pretty accurate also of people in the Anglosphere. At least it's far more common that, or it's more of a cultural tendency that we like to be independent. Whereas in China and also in Taiwan, based upon my experiences, that is not the case. In fact, as we see in the red picture, they like to be together. They like to do things together. Okay, let's look at the next picture, and this one is punctuality. So the Germans, when they say 12 o'clock, they mean 12 o'clock. And the Germans are famous for being very punctual and being obsessed with the time. The Swiss even more so. Swiss Germans even more so. And that seems to be true of the Germans. My father went to Germany a little while ago to visit some relatives. He had a cousin over there, and he went to he travelled around with his cousin and his cousin's wife. And when my parents would go downstairs in the morning to have breakfast, they had agreed to meet at, say, 8 o'clock. So my parents would go down there to eat at 5 to 8, and my father's cousin and his wife had already finished eating and were freaking out as though my parents were late, even though they were 5 minutes early. Now, I'd say Australians are not as punctual as Germans. They're even a little bit slack at times. But as we can see, I think they are more obsessed with punctuality than Taiwanese and Chinese, certainly. As you can see there, basically 12 o'clock to Chinese means anywhere between 5 to 12 and 10 past 12. I think she's being a little bit generous there. My experiences based upon Chinese and Taiwanese is that 12 o'clock basically means you get there. If you're punctual, if you're really punctual, you get there at 5 past 12. And if you're not very punctual, you arrive at 25 past 12. So I think she's being a little bit generous there. Nevertheless, let's move on. The next one is a party, being at a party. Okay, so you can see Germans, and I think this is also true of Westerners in general, they like to break off into small groups and have a chat or do whatever they do. Whereas Chinese like to form a big circle, and this is certainly true. They get in a big circle and there'll be one person or a few people talking, perhaps over the top of each other, and people laughing and so on, but there'll be basically one person holding court. And this is also true not just at parties, but at restaurants. Generally, you'll find in Taiwan, when there are sort of like large banquets and so on, they sit around a round table, that's also because they have one of those, I think they're called lazy Susans, those things in the middle of the table they can rotate because they all eat from dishes, right? The common dishes, and they take a little bit and put it on there or put it in their own bowls. So that's partly to do with that, I suspect. But nevertheless, they like to get in a big circle and take it in turns, basically, not in small groups. Let's look at the next picture, which is beauty, or the ideal of beauty. So on the left, you can see Germans like to be tanned, and I think that's true to some extent in the West. If you're really pale, you'll often be mocked for being very pasty, whereas in this manifests itself in all sorts of ways. Even in Australia, they're trying to sort of cut down on people getting tan because of skin cancer and so on, but there's still very much this idea of the bronzed Aussie, guys running around in the surf and, lifesavers and so on, tanned guys. Whereas in China, and this is also extremely true in Taiwan, people, especially women, do not like to be tanned at all. Now, they actually have similar historic origins. In fact, the people in the West for a very long time did not like to be tanned either. And the origins are similar to that in other parts of the world, in that if you were tanned, that meant that you worked outdoors for a living. And if you worked outdoors for a living, that meant basically you were at the lower echelon or echelons of society. Whereas if you worked indoors or didn't work at all, you would not get tanned, obviously. And so there was sort of a class marker there to do with the colour of your skin. And that's still very much the case in Taiwan to this day. You will see women, farmers, who will cover themselves up completely so that they do not tan at all. And also skin whitening creams are extremely popular amongst Taiwanese because some of them naturally have darker skin. Some don't. Those whose ancestors came from northern China are quite fair, but those who came from southern China, or maybe have Aboriginal blood, they are really obsessed about whitening their skin, some women. Now, that was the case also, as I mentioned, in the West for a long time, but it changed, and there were two ways in which it changed. One was in both the US and the UK, during the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of people, industrialists, who made a lot of money because of the Industrial Revolution, and those people came from places that were not very sunny, so England or New England, and it became a status marker if in the middle of winter they could go off to Florida or the Mediterranean and reappear in the dead of winter with a tan. That showed that they had both the time and money to be able to just drop what they were doing and go on a vacation somewhere. So that started to change there in both North America and also Europe. But apparently there was one particular incident where it really changed. And that was, I think it was Coco Chanel, the fashion designer. She apparently one year, I think this was in the 60s, she spent the entire summer on a yacht in the Mediterranean and got quite burnt and then, of course, quite tanned afterwards. And she appeared at an event or something, and everyone saw that she was really tanned, and that was sort of a watershed moment in many ways. Whereas that's not the case. Even now, when people travel from Asia, they still do not like to get tanned. It's becoming more common, but it's still not very common. Okay, the next one is elderly in day-to-day life. So there we have the poor Westerner who does not have a grandchild, or maybe does have a grandchild, but the parents don't go and visit the grandparent with the grandchild. So the elderly person has a dog instead. And I don't know, I mean, that's somewhat true, I guess. Whereas for Chinese, and this is true for Taiwanese to some extent, the grandparent will look after the child. And indeed, a lot of children in Taiwan are actually raised by their grandparents. Their parents are so busy working that they don't spend much time with their kids. Even to the point where sometimes, if they're from a more rural part of Taiwan or something like that, they leave their kids with their grandparents and they only visit them on weekends. They go off to the cities to work and they only see their kids on the weekends, or sometimes not even that frequently. Now, that's not entirely true all of the time, because there are actually a lot of Taiwanese people who don't have grandchildren. The current fertility rates in Taiwan and East Asia generally are much lower than in Germany or the West, actually. So it's actually moving more towards being like the blue half of the picture, even more so than that is the case in the West. So things are changing a bit there. All right, now the next picture is the boss. So as you can see here, the boss, who is represented in white as opposed to all of those black people, and I don't know if there are some racist undertones there or not, but the boss, the white man, he's slightly taller than his colleagues or his subordinates in Germany, but not by very much. So it's very egalitarian. And I think if you were to look at, the American or Australian or British equivalent, he would be slightly taller again. He wouldn't be quite as lowly, as egalitarian as his employees. However, in China, and this is certainly true in Taiwan, the boss is a king. His word is law. Everyone kowtows to him, and people don't want to rock the boat. That's very true in Taiwan, and that's not just true in businesses. It's true in the government. It's true in schools, all sorts of institutions. Basically, any organisation will have a very rigid hierarchy and a very pronounced hierarchy as well. Okay, the next picture is the noise level inside a restaurant. So what you can see there is that in Germany, and I think this is pretty typical in other Western nations, there'll be a little bit of noise, but people at each table do not like to disturb people at other tables, and so they talk at a fairly low level, just enough to be heard, basically. However, I mean, look, that's not always true. Obviously, if there's a big party, the bigger the group, obviously, the noise seems to sort of increase exponentially, particularly if there's any alcohol involved. But nevertheless, I think it's true. However, for Chinese, and this has been my experience both of Chinese and Taiwanese, and I think Chinese are a little bit noisier than Taiwanese, but nevertheless, anywhere you go, not just at a restaurant, but anywhere you go, they are extremely noisy. Everyone talks at the same time, and I often say Taiwanese do not talk to each other, they shout at each other. They can be standing 2 feet away from each other and still shouting at each other. And not because they're angry or anything, just because that's how they do it, right? And so, restaurants are very loud places in Taiwan and China, presumably also. Okay, the next one is problem solving, or the approach to problem solving. Okay, so you can see Germans, and again, I think this is very true of Westerners in general. They are very direct. They will go to a problem or through the problem, and they will not hesitate to do so. On the other hand, in China, and this is also true in Taiwan, not only do they not like to directly approach it, but they will actually sidestep it many times and hope that the problem goes away by itself, which can be quite difficult to deal with as a Westerner at times. You feel like people are giving you the runaround or that they're being dishonest with you. On the other hand, Taiwanese people say that Westerners are very crass, almost, because they have no sort of diplomacy. They have no subtlety. They just get right to it like a bull in a china shop. So, two different perspectives on that there. Okay, the next one is the size of the individual's ego, or the sense of self. And of course, as all of these are, they're stereotypes, right? But basically, the German, and I think this is true for other Westerners, the German or the Westerner thinks very highly of himself, thinks he's very important, thinks he's much better than he is, and so on and so forth. Whereas the Chinese or Taiwanese thinks less of himself than he perhaps should, and thinks he's not that important. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but I think that's generally fairly true. A lot of people are quite meek here and underestimate their talents and so on. In fact, there was some sort of survey done a while ago, I remember reading about this or hearing about this, where they asked different students from different countries in the world how they thought they would perform on a particular test. I think it was a mathematics test or a science test. And they said, how do you think you'll perform? And American students grossly overestimated how good they were at mathematics or science. And then I think it was South Korean students grossly underestimated how good they were at science and maths. And the South Koreans, of course, also greatly outperformed the American students. So I think this is true. Westerners do have an overinflated opinion of themselves compared to Chinese, Taiwanese, other East Asians. All right, the next one is the perception of how Germans and Chinese see one another. Now, I really don't know if this is accurate, to be honest. I'm not German and I'm not Chinese. But, I mean, if you look at that picture, so Germans think Chinese basically have little beards, those Fu Manchu beards, and they wear conical straw hats, and they drink a lot of tea, and they eat a lot of rice. Well, the tea and the rice pictures are certainly actually quite correct. You won't see very many people here with either straw hats or even those particular beards in Taiwan, at least. And then as for the pictures of how Chinese perceive Germans, so you have a man there with a rather admirable and a moustache of which I'm quite envious, actually, a sort of Friedrich Nietzsche style moustache there, and a hat. I don't know what those hats are called, those traditional hats with the feather in them. Well, obviously, very few Germans wear those. I know that much to be true. I guess maybe at festivals or something they wear them, but very few. And Chinese perceive Germans as eating a lot of sausages and drinking a lot of beer. I don't know if they do or not. I know Germans drink a lot of beer. I don't know how many sausages they eat. Presumably they eat quite a few, though. Who knows? But nevertheless, those are the perceptions according to this artist. All right, so, and actually about that picture of the German man with the moustache and the hat with the feather in it, there's actually a chain of bakeries in Taiwan run by a German, or founded by a German, and the picture he has is presumably meant to resemble him, and it actually looks like that. He has a big moustache and he's wearing one of those hats. So he has sort of self-stereotyped him, and I guess to some extent that is instantly recognisable as being German by Taiwanese. So maybe it is quite accurate, that particular picture. Okay, the next one is queuing or standing in line. Now, I think this is actually quite accurate both for Westerners and Chinese and Taiwanese. I mean, the British are famous for queuing. It's changing, of course, but it's almost a sort of a national pastime. It's an obsession. It's an art form, queuing in the UK. Though it would be much straighter than that. And likewise in Taiwan, people queue when they're told to queue, basically. Otherwise, it is a bit of a free-for-all. And that picture there very much represents my experience on more than one occasion trying to get on or off a train. Not at the MRT. They actually have special lines on the ground. The MRT is the subway system in Taipei. They actually have lines on the ground. You have to stand in the lines, and there's sort of a space for people to alight from the carriage. But at the normal trains, the national train system, they don't have that, and it does very much resemble that picture at times. Particularly with old people, I have found all over the world, old people seem to very much lack manners. I think they get to a particular point in their life and they just say, screw it, that's it, I'm done with this manners thing and I'm just going to do what I want. And they just push on. They just, they'll literally push through a whole bunch of people who are trying to get off a train just to get on a train. And I've experienced that everywhere in the world, including in Taiwan. Okay, the next one is, here it says complexity of self-expression. I think that before I've seen that picture, and it's something about getting to the point or expressing an opinion or something. But But basically, the Germans, and I think this is fairly true of Westerners, they just get straight down to the point. They'll just say, right, this is what I want, or, what do you think, yes or no? Whereas Chinese, and this is true for Taiwanese as well, they do not like to do it that way. They like to go around a bit and sort of take their time getting to the point. They don't want to confront you. They don't like yes or no situations, and they don't like to express hard desires or requests. They like to very much give you some wiggle room so that you don't have to embarrass yourself by saying no or disagreeing with them. And whilst we, as with one of the previous pictures, whilst we might find that a little bit dishonest or something like that, they find us a little bit crass for not allowing providing the other person with the opportunity to save face, to not embarrass themselves by disagreeing. All right, so the next one is traveling and recording memories. It says here, I don't think it actually says that. I can't read the Chinese, but I think it says travel. All right, so basically you can see there the Germans, and I think this is true of Westerners in general, we like to imagine we go to see, the pyramids, or we go to see, a waterfall or something. We like to just take it all in and look at it, and then remember it. Whereas, certainly in Taiwan, and I think this is true for East Asians in general, you must take many, many photos. You must then, of course, upload those to Facebook and do lots of attention whoring as well. And this is particularly true of food. So if you go to a restaurant to eat a meal, you spend maybe half an hour, ordering and waiting for the food, and then the eating process is half an hour, and in the interim there's about 4 hours of taking photos before you actually take the first bite of the food. They do very much love to look through the world, through a camera at the world in East Asia. All right, now, and I've often considered making a website just of selfies of me with my sister-in-law in the background, taking selfies of herself with food. All right, so the next one is connections and contacts. So you can see in the West we don't tend to have that many contacts, perhaps. I think maybe somewhat more than that, but nevertheless we don't. Whereas in China, and this is very true in Taiwan also, everyone knows everyone in some way or another, because you never know when you might need to do business with that one or that person, or when someone might be able to help you in some other way. And indeed, when I got married to my wife, at our wedding, there were a whole lot of people. I'd say probably almost half of the people there were people that neither of us had ever met before, but they were there because they knew my father-in-law, and they attended because he had attended their children's weddings, or they knew him, and in the future he was going to attend their children's weddings. And there was this big thing. It's called guanqi connections. Basically, you have all these mutual social obligations to people, and it's very much a thing that I think Northern European countries, particularly the UK and its derivatives, those were societies that were very outwardly focused. They were very willing to accept people from outside, and so you didn't have to have this real clannishness like you do in other parts of the world, which I think is true of Chinese culture. There's a real clannishness, and so rather than just meeting someone and saying, okay, well, let's just sort of engage in commerce, or let the rule of law sort of sort these things out so that we don't rip each other off, in Chinese culture it was very much that you're either sort of in the circle of trust or you're not in the circle of trust. And so that's why connections are very, very important even to this day in both China and Taiwan. Okay, so the next one is 3 meals a day. Now, according to this, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but according to this, in Germany, they have cold meals in the morning, so breakfast, and at night for dinner. But they have hot meals. They have a hot lunch in the middle of the day. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I think if we were to give a representation of that for people from the Anglosphere, I think probably the morning meal would be sort of cold or perhaps semi-cold, because toast, I guess, is a warm item of food. But, breakfast cereal is a cold thing. And lunch would probably be cold as well. You'd have a sandwich perhaps. Maybe it might be hot. You might have a meat pie or something. But, probably a sandwich is the stereotypical lunchtime food, which is cold, generally speaking. And then dinner would almost certainly be a hot meal, cooked meal. Whereas for the Chinese and the Taiwanese, and I think this is pretty accurate, basically all of their meals are cooked meals. Now the historic reasons for this are to do with hygiene, because you wanted to boil water all the time, make sure everything was cooked. So they actually don't like salads in Taiwan. They don't like the concept of eating raw vegetables. Even if they've been washed, they don't like that concept at all. And so all of their meals are cooked meals, hot meals, basically, even breakfast. Some people will eat cold meals at other times, sandwiches or stuff like that. But generally speaking, even breakfast is always cooked, fried, or if they eat, they have a thing called congee, which is sort of like a rice porridge. It's really watery though, and that's hot as well. So yeah, they basically have hot meals every meal. All right, the next one, I quite like this one. It's very amusing to me. Is animals. So Germans and Westerners generally, we see a picture of, we see some animals and we think, oh wow, look at those birds in the tree. Aren't they lovely? Isn't that delightful? And we imagine, wild animals in Africa, zebras galloping across the savannah and lions and, all of this sort of stuff, right? We love to see animals in nature. Chinese and Taiwanese as well, when they see an animal, they think, what would I eat that with? How would I garnish that? Which sauce would I use on that? Very much so. If it moves, they eat it. And I often sort of tease my wife about some of the things you can find in night markets, or I exaggerate about things that you can't find in night markets but should find in night markets in Taiwan. And I'll tell you a little story about myself with this. Once I went out with my wife and one of her sisters to a restaurant near where we lived, and they had a poster on the wall, and it had some geese on there, some Siberian geese that I guess they migrate to Taiwan for part of the year. And I thought, oh, isn't that lovely? They're putting a poster there saying, please help, because I could only read parts of it, so I couldn't really understand it fully. I thought, oh, isn't that lovely? They're saying, please protect the environment and save this endangered species or something, right? And so I said this to my wife and to her sister, and they cracked up laughing. And my wife said, no, it's not saying that at all. It's saying quickly get these before they run out. Stocks are limited. So basically, quickly eat this before they're all gone. Which I thought was quite amusing, and they thought it was highly amusing that I had thought something completely different. So I see a strange animal, and I think, well, we'd better look after that. Oh, that's great if they're looking after that. And Taiwanese think, yummy. All right, so the next picture is anger, and I think this is fairly accurate, actually. Of course, it's not always the case, but basically what it's saying is that if Germans feel unhappy and if Westerners feel unhappy, they will show it. So they will frown. And people say that to me. Taiwanese people say that to me all the time, that I do that. I frown a lot. And I'm a very serious person. Whereas Chinese and Taiwanese, to a large extent, of course this is not always true, basically they won't show you what they're feeling. They'll smile. They want to be happy. They want everyone to think they're happy. They don't complain as much. Certainly with people with whom they're not very close, or people they've only just met, they won't tend to show them what they're really feeling. So I think that's actually fairly accurate. And the next picture is somewhat related to that, and that picture is to do with the weather. And again, in both pictures, the German and the Chinese person, when it's sunny outside, they're both happy, they're smiling. But when it's raining outside, the German person is frowning. He doesn't like the rainy weather and he's unhappy because he's stuck indoors. But the Chinese person will still smile. I'm not sure whether that's because they're hiding their emotions there or just because they don't care if it's raining. I don't know. It's maybe both. Okay, and then let's look at the next picture. And this one is new things. So what's happening in this picture is you have a German person, and the new thing is represented by that black triangle. The German person is maybe slightly suspicious about that thing. He's thinking, okay, I don't want to be too close to that. And of course, young people, they always like to embrace new technology and so on. But nevertheless, people are slightly more suspicious of new things. So you could think of genetically modified foods, for instance. Or you could think of convenience stores and stuff like that. But generally, people would think they're a little bit gauche because the food's not very good, and they might say, well, why do you need to be able to go and buy food or pay a bill or something at 3 o'clock in the morning? That's just indicative of the fact that people's personal time is being encroached upon by corporations and so on and so forth, right? So that, there will be criticisms of new things, whereas Chinese people, and this is true also of Taiwanese, they're actually fairly acritical a lot of the time to do with new things. People in Taiwan will always say to me, Taiwan's really convenient, the convenience stores are really good. And I say, yeah, but they come at a cost, obviously, in terms of people's personal lives. And people, they're really obsessed with the uptake of technology here. So I think that's fairly accurate, that picture. Okay, the next picture is a stomach ache. Now, the German picture, that looks like a Coca-Cola bottle. I'm not sure. I think it is. I think it's meant to be a Coca-Cola bottle. I don't know if Germans actually drink Coca-Cola if they have a stomach ache. Maybe they do. I'm not sure where she would have got that idea from otherwise. And I know that Coca-Cola was originally, it began as a health tonic, if I remember correctly. Many things did actually. Cornflakes did as well, if I remember correctly. They were originally marketed as a health food. I think cigarettes were at one point too. But nevertheless, pardon me, I think according to this, Germans drink Coca-Cola if they have a stomach ache, and Chinese drink tea. I don't know if either of those two things is that correct. Chinese might have some herbs or something, but I don't think they drink tea just to feel better. Maybe some older Chinese. I don't know. Taiwanese. Don't really know with that one. That's a little bit strange. Okay, the next one is the child. Now, the left-hand picture, the blue picture, is of the German family, and you have a man and a woman on either side of the child, and then you have the grandparents off to the side still. And so what it's saying is the child is very much raised only by the parents, and the grandparents are sort of not really very involved. Of course, if we were to sort of update this, we might have two men raising the child, or two women raising the child, or perhaps a single mother, or a single mother with a sort of a living ghetto boyfriend, and three children to different fathers, that kind of thing. But I guess they're kind of looking at a middle class family in the West. It's they need to update this, I think, as opposed to the Chinese family where the parents and the grandparents are all sort of equally involved. And I discussed that earlier, actually, in that it's actually common in Taiwan for grandparents to raise kids. The parents might see them only on the weekends, or maybe not even that frequently, because during the week they work really long hours, and they might not see their kids very much, if at all, during the week. Or they might even work somewhere else in the country, or even abroad in China. It's quite common for Taiwanese. I think there are 1 million Taiwanese out of about 23 million Taiwanese who are working in China. And some of them, because they have factories and so on, some of them have taken their families with them, but it's not that uncommon for a businessman to have his family in Taiwan, and he lives and works in China, maybe has a mistress or two on the side as well. But basically, even in Taiwan, you'll have quite a few people who, especially if they're from the countryside, they will leave the kids with the grandparents, and they will go off to a big city and work, and then they'll return on the weekends, or maybe not even that frequently, which is a little bit sad for those kids. Okay, the next picture is what's trendy. Okay, so basically you can see there for Germans what's trendy is Asian food, and for Chinese, and this is true of Taiwanese as well, what's trendy is Western food. Okay, so that's I think that's fairly accurate, at least for the middle class. I think it's a bit different for the upper middle class. Well, not the upper middle class, the upper class, but yeah, I think it's true for the middle class in both countries, or in the West versus the East. The next one is shower time. Now, in the West, we tend to shower in the evenings. Oh, no, sorry. We tend to shower in the mornings in the West. The idea being that you want to go to work and you want to smell nice and you want to sort of put your best foot forward for the day. However, in Taiwan, and it seems to be the same in China, people shower at the end of the day, just before they go to bed. And the reason for this is they don't like to sleep on clean sheets if they're dirty. Now you might very well ask, well, what happens during the day? Do they go to work without having showered? And the answer is yes, in a lot of cases. Now, they don't sweat anywhere near as much as Westerners, actually. That's actually a genetic thing. There's a gene that supposedly accounts for three things. This gene is different between Westerners and East Asians. And that gene basically means that Westerners sweat more. They have much more waxy earwax. And my wife freaks out about that. She freaks out about that with our child too, actually, because in very many ways, he's far more like me than he is like her. And the other one is to do with breast size. Supposedly that gene also accounts for why Western women have larger breasts. It controls those three things. So East Asians don't actually sweat anywhere near as much as Westerners. Nevertheless, in the past, when I have taught teenagers in Taiwan, you get these teenage boys, they're very hormonal and they're running around, they go and play basketball at lunchtime and so on. They're running around, they're all sweaty, and they come to class, it's gross. Especially if, they didn't have a shower that morning. And especially since often they have two uniforms, or three actually. They sort of have a summer and winter uniform, and they also have a sports uniform, a PE uniform. And on the days when they have PE, they wear the uniform the whole day, the PE uniform the whole day, and they might have PE a couple of times that week. Some kids don't wash their PE uniforms, but even if they do, between days, they wear. So imagine they do PE the period just before lunch, then they go and run around at lunch, and then you teach them in the afternoon, and you've got all these sweaty boys. It's gross, right? But I guess their attitude towards showering is, as I said, they don't want to go on to clean sheets with a dirty body. And in some places, I think in Thailand, for instance, they shower multiple times throughout the day. So maybe they get around it like that. Okay, and the last picture is Sunday on city streets. So you can see only a handful of people on the streets in Germany on a Sunday. I think that's somewhat true in the West. People on a Sunday, they will tend to go and visit relatives or friends. They won't be wandering around the city. I mean, indeed, many shops, not all shops, but many shops will be closed on Sundays. So they will either go and visit someone or have people come and visit them. Or they might go somewhere, they'll go for a drive somewhere, they'll go to a particular place out in the countryside or the beach or something. But they don't wander around the streets, the city centre, the commercial district. However, in China, and this also is quite true in Taiwan, if you go out, well, not just on Sundays all the time, but especially on the weekends, every man and his dog is there, shopping primarily, eating, doing that kind of stuff, engaging in commerce. They don't tend to visit one another, or if they do, they will then go to a restaurant anyway, but they don't tend to visit one another. That's not such a cultural thing in Taiwan. Even with relatives to some extent, as I said, they'll go out to eat. They won't all hang around at that person's house. And some people go out into nature, but generally speaking, the majority of them will sort of hang around shopping and eating at restaurants and so on. So that seems to be fairly accurate. All right, so I hope you have enjoyed my commentary or found it informative on East Meets West, an infographic portrait by Yang Liao. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.